It's Mazzy here. The experimental music tag, the Beatles edition. Depending on how you got here, if you just saw the Beatles and you're a Beatle fanatic or a Beatle fan or just mildly interested in the Beatles and got here, this might be a little different for you. If you're a regular on my channel and you watched the video I literally posted yesterday about the experimental music tag, I'll put a link below of that. So in a way that you should watch that one first, but maybe if you're just not into experimental music or not really aware of what it even is, watch this one, get you acclimated, and then go watch that one to get a little deeper dive into my view of it. Now, this is based on an original vinyl tag created by Alex from Southern California. Motoric 247 is his channel name, and he presented a list of 8 questions making up the experimental vinyl tag. If you don't know what a vinyl tag is, it is a series of questions that people who make videos may answer. Even if you're just a fan and you don't make videos and you're just a music lover and record collector, maybe you can put answers to your questions in there. But I thought I was going to do a music all Beatle version of this experimental tag yesterday. I thought, that's not what that is about. But I thought it was really interesting, and it occurred to me in dreams last night what this should be. So I'm going to go through those same questions that I answered on yesterday's tag, but they're going to be all Beatle related. And the Beatles really introduced a lot of fans of my generation into all kinds of music, whether it's classical because of the music used in the soundtrack to Help, Beethoven, Wagner, and the like, and several other albums, avant-garde music with Paul McCartney and John Lennon and Yoko Ono, obviously, coming from the Fluxus. So this is an interesting tag to use as an outline for records from the Beatles solo and their immediate family. So let's go with question number 1. Show a record with improvised music. What I decided to do would be showcase Sometime in New York from 1972, so we're right in the 50th year of this anniversary. This was not a successful album by John and Yoko. Very political, used first disc is studio work with some great songs backed by the Elephant Memory Band, which I'm not a fan of. I think they're a little too sloppy, and I think Lennon personally needed a little more rigid format with amongst these wonderful songs like Luck of the Irish, New York City, Attica State, John Sinclair, Sunny Bloody Sunday, Luck of the Irish, and so on. But the second disc of this was done from an appearance that John and Yoko showed up at the Fillmore East on a night when Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention played. And Yoko was on stage, John, and they did some improvisation and some jamming. And it's the Jam LP that came out as a second LP in this collection, like this. Now, you might recognize this cover because of this. Now, apparently, unbeknownst to Zappa, Lennon and Yoko and Ono took these tapes and put it out on this album. I think Zappa was not happy at all. But in this expanded edition that just came out this year, this is a Mother's Fillmore East, June 1971, there is a version of this jam with John and Yoko included here. And I have to say, this is the best sounding version of it. And now that is out there, improvisational, experimental, not for everyone, not for the faint of heart. If you're not a Yoko fan or a John and Yoko fan, as their experimental, collective Fluxus movement performance art style, you're not going to be into this. But this is actually a great collection. And this is when Flo and Eddie, Howard Kamen, and Mark Volman from the Turtles were on tour with Frank Zappa and the Mothers. So that's question number 1, and that's my response in the Beatle world to question number 1. Number 2, show record featuring a Moog synthesizer. Now, in the video I did yesterday, the initial response to the experimental music vinyl tag, I realized the first half of that question and that discussion, I pronounced it Moog synthesizer. Well, Robert Moog, the inventor, is actually Robert Moog. It's pronounced Moog, even though it's a double O. It's the Moog synthesizer, so I apologize for that correction. So far, I haven't had any corrections, viewers correcting me on that. So, the Moog synthesizer in the world of Beatles. Not the only contribution, but look, I'm going to start with this. I mentioned this yesterday, and this was one of, I believe, two or three records that came out on the Zapple label. I believe 2 or 3. I always get that confused. Zapple was the experimental offshoot of Apple Records, and in the late 60s, it was dreamed up to be an experimental label that would have electronic music and poetry and spoken word. And George Harrison put this out. He was one of the first adopters in the UK of acquired a Moog synthesizer, and the Beatles played around with it, mainly George Harrison. And it would turn up on this album, including on George Harrison's own composition, Here Comes the Sun. Moog synthesizer. But this is the one I really want to showcase. I mentioned this yesterday, showcased it yesterday. The controversy of this was Bernie Krause from Beaver and Krause, Paul Beaver and Bernie Krause, who put a series of Moog synthesizer records out on Warner Brothers Records, and that were two of the original promoters and sellers of the Moog synthesizers in California in the late 60s. Went to Friar Park, George's estate, and helped George play with this and set it up and experiment with it, and kind of taught him how to play it and what he could get out of it. Well, that experimental tape turned up on one side of this record without the knowledge of Bernie Krause. And right here, his name was crossed off here on this edition of this. When electronic sounds came out, it was really perplexing to a lot of Beatle fans because it's electronic, it's noisy, there's no cohesiveness to it, but that's not the point of this music. Coming from the likes of John Cage and a whole audience that most Beatle fans didn't know about, weren't aware about. But I think over the years, this has grown in stature to a point for people in avant-garde music and electronic music. So for this question, electronic sounds, George Harrison and Abbey Road, the Moog synthesizer was used on several compositions on this album. Now the next question is show a record that's a field recording. Field recordings are when documentarians, when archivists go out in the field and record the sounds of an environment. Sometimes they're musicians, sometimes they're natural ambient sounds of the city, the country, aviary, animals and things. Well, I have two here I picked for this, and these are two from the John and Yoko Unfinished Music Volume 1 and 2, and the first is Two Versions. Two Versions came out in 1968, literally several weeks before the White Album, and it came out on Apple Records. Now, the Beatles album on Apple was their first full-length album on Apple Records after that year, the Hey Jude single, Revolution single. This came out actually on Tetragrammaton Records because Capitol EMI refused to put it out. So it had this plain cover, Bagism, part of the whole Fluxus ambient movement, field recordings. John and Yoko playing around with tape recorders. They played and made these sounds and these tape loops and voices and discussions all night. And they woke up in the morning and made love, apparently, for the first time. This has the infamous naked covers that was banned on the Apple label, distributed by Tetragrammaton. John Lennon and Yoko. The other one is Life with the Lions, Unfinished Music Volume 2. This is, again, on Zapple Records, the experimental wing that was later shut down by Alan Klein. And some records were not released at the time. In fact, it was going to be a series of poetry records that were going to come out by Lawrence Ferlinghetti, the Beat Generation poet who owned City Lights Books in San Francisco, also the beat poet Michael McClure, also a spoken word record by the writer Richard Brodigan, and even a live recording from Lenny Bruce. And it was all shut down, never to be released on Zapple Records. This is a picture taken right after Yoko had a miscarriage in 1968. This is at Queen Charlotte's Hospital in London. The other side is live Cambridge University. So very much a portion of this is a field recording, and I think really perfect for this answer. In experimental music, the Beatles version, the Beatles experiment, avant-garde, not for the faint of heart, not for everyone. Okay, next question. Show a record with a drone sound. Well, I don't know if it's the first drone I ever heard in 1966. Obviously, the drone comes from Indian music, the use of the tambura, and it's a repetitive note, a repetitive one tone, no chorus, almost a rhythmic sound that continues throughout a piece of music. And I'd say one of the prime examples, not George Harrison, but is John Lennon's use of that drone. I think he does it in the key of C over and over again on the final cut on this album, Tomorrow Never Knows. Maybe the second most experimental track the Beatles ever recorded. And John Lennon, his voice is augmented, his voice is done through different sound effects, maybe possibly a Leslie speaker and different filters at the time. Not really filters, but through speakers, and recorded. And Jeff Emmerich worked as an engineer on this, of course, George Martin Productions. A lot of tape loops in reverse that has that seagull sound, that repetitive seagull sound that goes throughout it. This is an amazing record. This is a groundbreaking piece of music. The final cut, Tomorrow Never Knows, TNK, on Revolver, has that continuous drone sound. And some of the words of that John took from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and he was also very influenced by the book version of this. This is the Psychedelic Experience. These are readings. This is spoken word, and obviously not the Beatles, but influences John Lennon around that time, by Timothy Leary and Ralph Metzer, PhD, who, with Richard Alpert, who wrote this, the original book of the Psychedelic Experience of early uses of LSD, acid. Interesting cosmic experience. This is a reissue that originally came out on Broadside Records in the 1960s from the Smithsonian Records. Also, I would say George Harrison's contribution in 1968. Obviously, he's the one that introduced the Beatles to Indian music with the use of sitar on Norwegian Wood, became a very fan and a disciple and a student and just lifelong friend of Ravi Shankar and Ravi's family. But the soundtrack to Wonderwall, which I consider one of the best George Harrison solo records. Eric Clapton's on it, a lot of Indian musicians, recorded in London. Fantastic. There's some Western cowboy music on here. There's some psychedelic lead guitar by Eric Clapton. There's some honky-tonk piano. There's some Indian drone and Indian classical artists throughout this. This is a fantastic record, so I'm including this soundtrack, Wonderwall, to the film in this to answer this question as well. The next one is show a record with spoken word. Now, I did show those other records of the field recordings which have that, but I'm going to show two records. First, I'm going to continue with the trilogy, the final record in the experimental trilogy of John and Yoko, and that's the Wedding album. And this came out in a box set with this amazing package designed by Kosh, John Kosh, who would design the Abbey Road record cover. He would design Let It Be. He would also go on to design countless albums for on Asylum Records for Linda Ronstadt and so many other artists. Great, great designer. But this is a beautiful cover of the actual gatefold album that came in it, Bed for Peace. Recordings from the Amsterdam Hilton. It includes a replication of their marriage certificate. They went to the island of Gibraltar to get married. A picture book of the wedding. Another little overlay. Now this is what's really fun too here. Aside from the multiple books here, press reports, some of the press reports from the bed-in, the Amsterdam Hilton, and the bed-in for peace. And of course, we all got a slice, bagism, a slice of wedding cake. Talk about experimental, conceptual, so ahead of their time, so not for everyone. The problem here for many is that the Beatles, from John Lennon, a little bit of George, pushed this experimental Fluxus type performance art to a wider audience that was not prepared for it, was not into it, doesn't really enjoy it. The Fab fans were not into experimental avant-garde music. They're still not. They still criticize Yoko. They still criticize these unfinished music records. And I get that. It's not for everyone. Like experimental music, it's a acquired taste. So I just wanted to show those. I thought that would be a good one. One other one that to me is extremely important and probably the most avant-garde recording release the Beatles ever included. And some always feel it shouldn't be included, but I think it makes the end of this album. And then it goes into Good Night. And that is Revolution number 9 on the White Album. This is an original UK top loader copy. You all know that piece. It's the longest piece the Beatles ever recorded at over 8 minutes. It's an experiment that John, Yoko, and actually George Harrison put together at the end of one of their recordings, one of their versions of Revolution. The song Revolution goes on, and there's version out there into the anniversary editions and bootlegs, where they go on this Revolution kind of wild freak out at the end of the proper Lennon song Revolution. And it's screaming and noises and avant-garde things and tape loops. And what's really interesting about that, this comes from an influence from artists like the German composer Stockhausen, from Varese, the French avant-garde neoclassical electronic composer as well, using tape loops and synthesizers and electronic instruments. And the irony is, it was actually Paul McCartney who got into Stockhausen, first saw a performance in London, I believe in 1967. He was the one that was pushing the avant-garde and the out there and the conceptual art, having this White Album cover designed by Hamilton, Richard Hamilton, the modern artist, obviously Peter Blake with Sgt. Pepper. So Paul McCartney was the initial pusher, in a way, of some of this avant-gardeness, at least the visual arts, where John and Yoko really got into the aural arts of conceptual music and avant-garde, Stockhausen, Barre, and the like. So really interesting. I actually think the tape loops and the overdub voices and just the little bits and pieces from BBC archival recordings and Revolution number 9 is brilliant. I'm a fan of it, and I think it's really, really kind of wonderful. Okay, show a record with a processed instrument or voice. And I'm going to show two of the same albums, two of the two different versions of the albums. First, the American version of Magical Mystery Tour, which only came out on an album initially in the US. It was an EP initially in the UK. And what's great about this is the version, the song of George Harrison's song is Blue Jay Way. There's a fog upon LA, and George's voice is manipulated, and it goes through some really interesting changes, some backwards recording, and again, it's pretty experimental. It's not a pop fab masterpiece that the Beatles usually were up against and up for in those days, but I really like that. And the other song is, I'm just going to show another version. This is the Horzu version, which has all true stereo, the best sounding version you could ever get of this album, Magical Mystery Tour. And that is I Am the Walrus. There are so much in that, packed in that song of John Lennon kind of goofing on putting together these really interesting lyrics and words. Some make sense, some make total gibberish, just to kind of get the goat of reviewers and critics looking for meaning in a Lennon song. And what's great about it is the way his voice is filtered and is going through, again, through speakers as microphones and all the different complexities and tapes. And of course, at the end, they bring on recordings from the BBC of King Lear, Shakespeare's King Lear. And I think that's really a fantastic piece, having the voice manipulated on I'm the Walrus, and the various segments in that, and the orchestration is even manipulated as well. So love this version of this record. The next question is, show a record from an artist on the Nurse with a Wound list. Please watch that other video, the experimental video. I'll explain Nurse with Wound from the late 70s into the 80s, an experimental group of musicians that are really out there, noise, avant-garde. And there is a link below in the description here of the Nurse with Wound list. And there are a bunch of artists that were influenced in performances as well as artists they played with. Now, obviously, they didn't play with these two, but on the list, which I mentioned in that last video, were John and Yoko, because Yoko came from the Fluxus movement, her experimental versions. And I already showed these, or one of these, yesterday. I showed the Yoko version of this. This is the John version, because they cite John Lennon, Plastic Ono Band's record. Somewhat experimental, minimal, Arthur Janoff, screaming and primal therapy. John Lennon is just going through a lot here. John and Yoko are going through heroin addiction during this time as well. But fantastic record, minimal album, an explosive record. But that's from the Nurse with Wound list, as well as Yoko Ono. So last time I pulled Fly and her debut album. This time I'm showing Approximate Infinite Universe, Yoko Ono, because I am a fan of Yoko Ono's, and I am a fan of the experimentation and just the audacity sometimes on some of her records. So Yoko Ono for Nurse with Wound. That name alone is pretty much out there. And if you're here being a Beatle fan, you probably have no idea what you're talking about. But dive in. What's great about the Beatles, they turned us on at the time to a lot of different types of things, of art and music and fashion and experimentation, as well as pop masterpieces. So you can't deny that. And looking back 50 plus years, it's hard to understand what it was like at the time. And being there at the time, I was a young boy, young man, growing up and listening to this music and being turned on, being gobsmacked to the artistic just creativity, how it changed, and it seemed to come so fast. So I love that. The last question is, show a record featuring an instrument. And I'm just going to repeat the same one I showed yesterday. And that's from this album, which is very experimental, with a Peter Blake cover, who's an assemblage artist, a collage artist, and created these things not in Photoshop. No Photoshop was around then. These large, full-scale images of historic people that they kind of admired or were interested in at least showing. Even if they didn't admire all of them, they were profoundly, I almost want to say influential, but it's not really that. Just pop celebrities in a way. Can you imagine? They were like influencers of their day, maybe. Not always for the good, sometimes for the bad. But just the interesting thing of this, with this fold-out inner sleeve, cut-out mustache, Sgt. Pepper. And of course, the song is Lovely Rita Meter Maid, where the Beatles literally took combs, you put wax paper on them, and that's the sound you get. And that's in that song. Not a total child's toy, but it's what we as young people would play around with. We'd play with combs, wax paper, and make that. I don't have a comb anymore. Why would I have a comb? So that's the end of the experimental music vinyl tag, the Beatle edition. Hope you like it. Put your comments below. Do check out the other video of the more avant-garde experimental music. I think it's really interesting. And if you don't know about it, it's kind of an education. Even if you don't dabble in it, it's just you might get introduced to something that may open your ears and you open your eyes. Thanks again for watching. Mazzy loves you.